Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Happy days are here again. And well, you understand that understanding a question is half an answer, but this is half the answer. And this is your host, Trent R. Nelson. And of course, got Caitlin M. Green with us today as always. She's got a bit of a different camera view, and that's a good deal.
Listen, Trent, I'm suffering over here. I'm looking at my computer. I'm begging it to let me hear what is happening in the recording studio, and it said no. So you're on my phone right now, and that's fine. That's fine and cool, because I have 82% battery, and I'm ready to rock.
Let's go. Well, Caitlin, we have just had such wonderful people on to discuss just such a bevy of topics, whether it be college campus misinformation or what goes on in the bookstore, or even just asking some simple questions like, what is nationalism? What is heroic masculinity? What is personalism? But Caitlin, well, who have you brought with you today for a real good time?
You know, I have brought you somebody that I've been following on social media for a long time who wrote a great book that I love. His name is Victor Ray, and he is the F. Wendell Miller Associate Professor in the Departments of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Iowa. And he's a Business and Global Society Fellow at the Harvard Business School, Vice President-elect of the American Sociological Association. Is that still true, or is that out of date?
That is true.
True, elect. Okay. And his research applies critical race theory to classic sociological questions. His work has won multiple awards. He's an active public scholar, which is how I know about him. Published in the New York Times, Time, CNN, Washington Post, Harvard Business Review, Boston Review.
Liberal Currents.
Hey!
Yes! I got to edit his review of the Working Homeless book, and it is so good. And I still haven't finished the book, but it's so good. It's so good. And his book on critical race theory, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care, is available from Random House. Victor, how are you?
I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
How about you?
I'm all right.
DEI. What is it? Why are we supposed to be so scared of it? Why does Jordan Peterson think it's cute and clever to rearrange the letters so that it spells D-I-E? Is he a small child? Science may never know. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are values that are meant to guide us to a more just society. For many white middle class and upper class folks, the only aspect of DEI that they seem to notice is stuff like annoying trainings, feeling like they need to read zeitgeisty books, or getting yelled at for assembling panels that are 100% populated by white people, and not really stepping out of their own shoes to think about what it really means. That, for example, despite being some of the most college-educated people in this country, Black women are extremely underrepresented in top positions. If the system we have in place now isn't putting the most qualified people in these roles, clearly some rules are necessary to fix the situation. When research shows that it's good for kids' emotional and intellectual development to have all kinds of people presented to them as valid ways to exist in this world, clearly a diversity of perspectives needs to be available in the form of books, media, lessons, and role models. But when we hear about DEI from the current administration, and let's face it, from the moderate, centrist, liberal pundit class, that's not what we get. What we get instead is a litany of rhetorical strategies designed to invalidate the whole concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We get DEI is a bloated, wasteful, unaccountable bureaucracy. We get DEI is actually racist. As Harvard professor Steven Pinker wrote on X, DEI programs make people hallucinate bigotry while turning them into bigots. We get the impulse is laudable, but its proponents go too far. We get DEI is the opposite of meritocracy, which resurrects the rotting zombie corpse of colorblindness to suggest that the way we gatekeep jobs, schooling, housing, etc. is totally rational and not at all impacted by the history and ideologies and current situations of race, gender, class, etc. in this country. Meanwhile, every time a person of color gets any position at all, we get to hear about how they didn't earn it, how some more qualified white person was probably passed over for that position. Even supposedly sympathetic people will suggest that the correct way to deal with racial inequality is by adopting colorblindness. Stanford professor Jonathan Burke wrote in an op ed, certainly a larger percentage of black students are disadvantaged than white ones, but if you are born poor, you are poor. What race you belong to does not alter the fact that you are an individual that had a bad draw and have a right to be treated as such. But if we really looked with clear eyes at what the people trying to roll back DEI want, it's to look at the list of CEOs, politicians, and other economic and cultural leaders in this country and see only wealthy white men. They're friends.
So, yeah, I think the reason why I connected with you in the beginning was because I was watching this sort of moral panic about critical race theory take off. And I was like, somebody needs to write a definitive for the layperson, like what actually is this thing and why is everybody freaking out about it? And you did that. And thank you so much for doing that.
Sure.
So today, though, it seems like the critical race theory phrase is fallen a little bit out of use in favor of DEI, which I feel like it was there kind of before CRT and it is now there after people have stopped yelling about CRT quite so much. Do you think that's right?
I do think that's right. And I think it's important to note that the same people who created the moral panic around critical race theory uh, are the ones doing this around DEI, right? So Christopher Rufo, the folks at the Manhattan Institute, the folks at Heritage, who saw in critical race theory a target that they could use to beat back racial progress. They realized that critical race theory was a very specific thing. DEI, especially in the way that they've construed it, was much broader, and they have successfully, convince the Trump administration, which I don't think they needed that much convincing, but convince the Trump administration to gut what they're calling DEI, but what I would argue is actually civil rights protections.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's kind of a way that DEI gets expanded to mean all kinds of different things and also narrowed when it's convenient, right? So we talked about this with things like academic freedom that happens to that as well. All of these kind of phrases that they get used as rhetorical footballs. You can say that DEI is actually, we're not attacking all of it. We're just attacking the annoying rules that are stopping us from doing what we want to do, or like the things that are restricting our free speech. And then it turns out that it's really anything that protects people on the basis of their civil rights. Let's look at some of the executive orders that have come out over the last couple of months, right? So right away, was it day one? The January 21st executive order, ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. So that already has a couple of things in it, right? Even the title itself, it says DEI is actually discrimination, and it says DEI doesn't have to do with merit. So that's something that we see a lot, right?
Right. So I think, there's so first of all, reading these executive orders is an exercise in frustration
Sure
because
is.
they're often incoherent and they're often internally inconsistent, right? So they don't even make sense as a sort of, you're like, no one outlined this before they wrote down sort of their rants that they got off of 4chan and
Honestly.
and then
Right.
cut and pasted into an executive order.
Yeah.
But you were specific about asking about saying that DEI is illegal discrimination.
Right.
This is a super strange claim that goes against sort of the history of DEI and how it's been interpreted by courts. Right? So, there's a ton of research from folks who are sort of liberals or on the left showing places in which real DEI policies were ineffective, right?
Mhm.
So, you know, the irritating video training that you have at work that someone who has thought about any of these issues for 2 minutes should be able to pass, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And this research has shown things that, like, you know, folks become more, they sort of reject it. And so in rejecting it, they then become hostile to diversity in the workplace more broadly, right?
Yeah.
This work was aimed at fixing DEI so we could integrate workplaces more effectively, right? Like the goal of these researchers was to say, how do we ensure that what we're doing is working?
Mhm.
That has been used by folks on the right to say these programs are ineffective and they are, you know, they cause what they claim to be fixing, and so we should get rid of them altogether, right? And so the sort of reparative goal of that research has been lost. The other thing that is weird about saying that it is discriminatory is that a lot of companies and businesses adopted DEI in order to be in compliance with anti-discrimination law from the 1960s.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that a lot of it was not effective, courts would look at the fact that a company had a not effective DEI policy, if they were, say, you know, accused of discrimination by someone in the workplace, and say, look, even though their policy isn't effective, this is a good faith effort at complying with anti-discrimination law.
Okay.
And so they would use that to then say the company is trying, even if they did discriminate in this case, we're going to say they made a good faith effort, they're trying to be compliant, and we are not going to award this defendant, you know, a settlement, or we're not going to allow them to win this case. And so as the right often does, they've literally inverted the way these policies have been applied and implemented and interpreted by courts, to say that they are discriminatory in order to, again, undermine broader civil rights protections.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you see this kind of sleight of hand all the time with questions of anti-racism. Like, I always love to go back to the 2019 paper by Mary Buckholtz, The Public Life of White Affects, where you ask somebody about racial issues, and even if they don't feel like they're racist themselves or whatever, like interpersonal racism doesn't even come into it, sometimes or frequently you will get this idea that, well, they're the ones who are trying to think about everything in terms of race, and that's actually quite racist if you think about it, right? So like anytime you try to do something about discrimination or racism, you end up getting accused of doing the racism yourself, right? Doing the discrimination yourself, which is just a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept of like there's a way of doing things that treats people unfairly based on their race, and there's a way of doing things that is conscious of that tendency and tries to undo it, right? Both of them are thinking about race, but they're not thinking about it in the same way at all.
Right. So this is one of the reasons why, you know, when I think about this stuff, or when I write about this stuff, I think historical context is always very, very important to bring in.
Yeah.
And when you look at many of the complaints that folks are saying, you know, DEI is discrimination against white people, or DEI is unqualified, it promotes unqualified folks.
Yeah.
These are literally, like, almost word for word, uh, like pat white supremacist tropes that go back to Reconstruction, right? And the immediate post-Civil War era, when folks would say, you know, well, Black folks need to, they need to earn their place, right? And so folks have just come out of a system in which they were literally held in bondage, not allowed to get educated, and immediately you have white supremacists saying, any effort aimed at ameliorating those conditions is actually discrimination against white people, right? It's actually will lead to Black dominance in politics or Black dominance in the workplace. And so when I hear this now, and you look at, you know, say, the complaints that Elon Musk was having about DEI in aviation.
Yeah.
And there you look and you're like, wait a minute, there's something like 2% black pilots in the country. What are we talking about here, right? How could this be causing a problem, right? And
Yeah.
it's so I might be exaggerating there on the 2%, but not by
Right.
much, right?
Sure.
It's maximum what 6-8%. It's very very low numbers.
Mhm.
And so I think that context of like these are not new complaints. This kind of stigmatization is a key feature of white supremacy throughout U.S. history, and they're just updating it for Twitter, right? Like they're
Yeah.
just
Right.
updating it for a sort of current push against people who, well, to distract against their own failings,
Mhm.
but
Right.
also to push people who they think of as less deserving out of the workplace.
Well, Victor, you said something just now that I think kind of triggered what we spoke about with Evan for a second here at the end of our discussion. Caitlin actually mentioned it, whereby these folks, these right wing, these fascist, authoritarians, whatever we'd like to call them, they sort of rely on keeping the timeline short, right? So
Mhm.
we don't know that this has happened before, that this is just another iteration of something we've dealt with in the 1980s or in the 19th century or
1870s. Yeah.
yeah, or 18 or whatever,
Right.
and that seems
Right.
like a consistent sort of return of no, all of this stuff just happened. Like Caitlin said, transgender people just began to exist in the 1990s.
That's right. That's when
And
they invented being transgender.
right. And so if we just don't think about the fact that they were trying to burn transgender literature in the 1930s, then we don't have to come to the conclusion that this is just like a recurring set of moral panics that some folks indulge in to sort of validate their own biases, no?
Right. So I think of it. So I think that historical point is very useful and important. The other way I think about this is like there have always been folks. There have always been racist folks who have an agenda that I think of as horrible, right? As not welcome in polite society, and that should be shunned, and that sometimes those folks are held back by political currents and by counter movements, and sometimes they are winning. And right now, I unfortunately think they are. They're winning, right? They're
Yeah.
empowered and they are doing everything they can. But among some portion of the population, that tendency was always there. They were just held in check by the legal system or by DEI policy in the workplace that didn't allow them to make a Nazi salute as they're giving a speech, and that those things. And so they're really pushing back to take the brakes off of a tendency that, again, some portion of the population has been pushing for since the civil rights movement or even further. I often think about this quote from Nixon that really sums it up when folks were trying to use the housing and urban development um, rules to desegregate. And Nixon's response was desegregation is just as bad as segregation. Forcing white people to integrate is just as bad as forcing people of color out. And I think that is sort of the tendency that's happening here around DEI.
Yeah, I would say we're like 5 minutes away from hearing like Musk or Vance or somebody say that. Right.
Well, I mean, so I would say this: Christopher Rufo was in the New York Times a few weeks ago saying the goal is the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
So it's not, and he was saying that they want to weaponize the Department of Justice in order to go after what is it, anti-Christian and anti-white discrimination. And I don't know if you all saw this yesterday,
Mhm.
but there was it yesterday or was sometime this week there was a long article in the Washington Post saying that almost half of the Justice Department lawyers in the Civil Rights Division have indicated that they're going to leave because of the administration's unwillingness to sort of support the traditional focus of that division, which is enforcing civil rights law
Yeah.
against, yeah.
Okay, well, it is May 1st today, right? And just this morning, the New York Times editorial board dropped an article about Trump's first 100 days. We made it, guys. And in
So
it,
far.
they talked about the like how an opposition coalition could work, and in it they have a paragraph that's like, hey, what we really need to do is like allow for the fact that Trump was right about some stuff and some of his policies might turn out great, actually. And in it, it talks about this. So they said, since taking office, he has largely closed the southern border, and many of his immigration policies are both legal and popular. He has reoriented federal programs to focus less on race, which many voters support. So yeah, it's this thing where it's getting laundered in the sort of liberal media that hey, there actually is a problem here, and if you can't admit that there's even a problem of like reverse racism or whatever, then we're never really gonna get this country back together, are we?
So there's a whole lot in that editorial. I think there's a couple of things when it comes to sort of race and racism or minority rights more broadly in the United States. If we think about what has been legal and popular to do to minority groups in the United States historically, I don't think we could argue very well that those things are moral or good or in
Right.
No.
favor of democracy at all, right?
Yeah.
So, there's this I think it's in the letter from Birmingham jail from Dr. King,
Mhm.
when he's talking about, everything that Hitler did was legal and everything that the Hungarian resistance did to push back the Soviet Union was illegal.
Of
And so
course.
if we make legality the sort of benchmark for our moral positions, then we're often going to fail, right?
Right.
Right.
The other thing is, with popularity, that sentence in terms of the civil rights movement, which the Times would say, that same editorial board would say, of course we support Dr. King, of course we support the broader civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Dr. King, I mean, they killed him. He was
Yeah.
hugely unpopular, right? Like, he was hugely unpopular during his lifetime. So when folks are like, DEI is unpopular, I'm like, of course it's unpopular.
Yeah.
When it works, which is marginal, because we haven't even talked about, how
Yeah.
little overall impact it has made on workplace demographics.
Right.
When it works, it does it's a minuscule intervention into pronounced structural racism in the United States, and even that is too much for people. Of course, it's
Right.
unpopular, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think popularity should be how we measure morality, how we measure
No.
our political goals, even.
That's right. Especially when it comes to these questions that have sort of plagued us since the beginning of our country, that like, what should we be doing about things like equality? Well, yeah, if we're just asking like the median voter, we're not going to really get there. Okay, so I wanted
by that
to.
metric,
Oh yeah,
also,
go for it.
the Times isn't popular with Trump voters. So,
Maybe they should just pack it in, right?
right, maybe they should stop pontificating about what we should do, since they
Take
are
their
so
own advice.
unpopular with, right.
Right.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about the sentiment that you referred to during Reconstruction, which was that like we shouldn't have to do anything special, right, to make sure that Black people are able to do well in this country. They should earn it, right? I was reading an essay or an op-ed in the Stanford Daily, which I don't think one should really do, but I did it anyway. And the person who wrote it they titled the thing "Why DEI Has No Place at Stanford." So let's start there with our attitudes. But one of the things that they brought up is, it's first of all, they're thinking about their friend who is poor and white, and how today they would never get into Stanford because a Black person would, I guess, take their spot. So that's something. And then the other thing that they did is they appealed to this idea that like, well, there's been help for people. So like the GI Bill, for example, he says, after World War II and the GI Bill, private universities like Stanford became places that provided opportunities to bright young minds from all strata in society. America's private universities rose to dominate the world. The benefits accrued to everybody because graduates contributed to society in a way that they could not have done without the education. Now, he points to the GI Bill. What's one famous thing about the GI Bill?
Right. I mean, so there were a number of reasons for this, but black soldiers
Yeah.
very rarely got their full GI Bill benefits, right?
Yeah.
Because of Southern white supremacy.
Yeah,
Right.
because the disbursement was handled locally, right? So then,
Right. So yes. So in order to get Southern buy-in, this was the kind of compromise that Congress is often forced to make, and that meant that local VA offices distributed the funds, and they kept black soldiers from getting those funds.
yeah. Yeah, and this isn't unique to the GI Bill, right? Like at any time we have some kind of sort of class-based distributive system that tries to even the playing field, it generally gets executed in a way that is racially unequal, right?
Right. It very often throughout U.S. history that has happened, and one of the things that about the GI Bill and federal FHA loans, those led to the racial wealth gap and sort of the biggest transfer of the biggest growth in white wealth in U.S. history, the growth of the white middle class, the great America that MAGA wants to go back to came about through those programs.
Yeah.
And black folks were totally excluded from them, right? Or if not totally excluded, mostly excluded.
Yeah.
And so the idea, I mean, it is so comforting and for folks like a Stanford professor who's saying my white friend was excluded to point to programs that systematically excluded people and then claim that they sort of worked their way into a system, right?
Yeah.
Because even they don't even know the history of the programs that they are claiming helped them get where they are, right?
Yeah.
And there's something about what one of my friends and co-authors, Jenny Mueller, calls white ignorance, and what you don't have to know, or what you can conveniently not know as a white person in the United States, and still or reject, right? The evidence you can reject. So yeah, I saw that, and I saw Hakeem's response to that too, which was excellent.
It was very powerful, and it brought up a really good point that it's not that they want to bring back merit, it's that they want to bring back monopoly, right? They don't really want to see any non-white faces if they can help it.
So I think that merit versus monopoly distinction that he uses is a really good one. And as we were sitting here, I'm at Harvard this year, and a while back there was an article that like 41 or 42% of Harvard's incoming class of undergrads were legacy admits or athletes.
Yeah.
And this is always the tell, right? If folks were really sort of unhappy about merit, this is what they'd be going after, right? They wouldn't be going after the 6 to 10% of the campus that is Black folks, or the 4 or 5% or maybe 8% that is Latino. They'd be going after the 42% who got in through having being Nepo babies.
Yeah.
Or, being an athlete and oftentimes not meeting the quote unquote standards of the institution.
Yeah, non-academic kind of avenues.
So it's, it is hard for me to take the meritocracy complaint seriously if you're not focused on the biggest drivers of influence that, a non-meritorious admissions that get folks in, right?
Yeah. So yeah, when we talked to Toby about masculinity and weird versions of feminism and things like that, we talked about the studies of talking time between women and men, or girls and boys, right? Where if you stack the odds so that the boys and the girls are speaking at the exact same amounts, people observing will say like, geez, those girls, they talk so much, they were dominating it. And it's that same kind of perceptual bias where, like, if you see a couple of Black professors or college presidents or CEOs or something, you are like, oh my God, it's really, you get that guy on the news being like, there's like whole teams of girls sports where it's 100% transgender students and no cis girls on the team at all, where you're like, I don't think that's true. I don't need to travel there to find out that that's not true.
Right. So I think of this as the Obama effect, right? So we've had one Black president, and in response to that, we get a resurgent white supremacy and all of this Trumpism, and like a real feeling among a significant proportion of the white polity that like they are losing influence and power in the country overall.
Right.
Yeah.
It's what Hancock's Lee is punching the air right now, being like, it's all status.
Right. I mean, it's what Johnson said, to put it in a different way. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you picking his pockets. And that's what they continue to do. They continue to utilize and leverage this internal disdain, this bias, to dominate the very people who they are pointing to others and saying, look, they're the ones who are screwing you. It's really a remarkable game, and I think that the white ignorance sort of helps to back this up to varying degrees, because you really can't save a whole bunch of those folks, because if you try to tell them something, you're also like a communist. So you have to take that into account as well. Trying to help makes you a comrade. And so that's not a good deal. And then we're just stuck with this sort of division. And sir, how does one even go about conceiving of trying to bridge such a division in which help is considered hindrance?
And I think about this in a couple of ways, right? So I am an educator, and I literally like spend the vast majority of my life thinking about like, how do I communicate ideas that I think are very important to folk. And on the one hand, I'm like, and typically I think about it in terms of the classroom, but also in op-eds or in my public writing and other ways. And a hard thing for me to accept pretty early on was like, okay, look, there's a proportion of the population that like you are not going to convince. Right?
Yeah.
And in that case, you have to defeat those folks politically, right? You have to win you have to create structures that marginalize them in sort of mainstream life, right? Mm-hmm. You have to not interview fascists in the New York Times.
Gosh, wouldn't that be nice? Literally every few months.
Right? So like stigmatizing public displays of racism is good, actually, right? We don't want people to be able to harass each other in the workplace, right? Mm-hmm. A prerequisite of being able to go to work should be freedom from harassment for everybody.
Yeah.
And so so that's one thing. The other thing is like I spend a lot of time really thinking about like how I phrase things, how I talk to folks, writing both for academics and the public in a way that, these ideas sort of, I hope they resonate.
Right.
But yeah, I think, that sense of like, some of this is not about convincing, some of this is not about education, and, it's about mobilizing. It's about it's about winning power. It's not about sort of hearts and minds.
Right.
And the other reason that I say this is, folks are often like, education is the key. And I'm like, the most educated folks in our society are also like doing some of the worst things in the world right now, right?
Yeah.
like they're like Harvard, Yale, these places are liberal bastions, and yet they all have degrees from these universities, and they're using those degrees to turn back civil rights, attack trans folks, deport citizens to third world gulags, you
Right.
know, they're
Right.
using that education to do evil in the world. And so like we have to think about ways to use our education to do things that are good, that
Yep.
Right.
less evil. I don't know.
Yeah. I noticed, yeah, there's, recently I was looking at Adrian Vermeule, right, where I was like, this guy, he really thinks that like Harvard is the hotbed of communist, racial radicalism, whatever, and like, didn't he? Doesn't he work there? Like,
Right.
don't,
Yeah.
don't they continue to employ him despite all of what he is?
Right. Right. So yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think, you know, universities, they might have more Democrats on faculty or whatever, but like they are designed to reproduce the social order.
Yeah.
And so they are, in important ways, small c conservative institutions.
Mhm.
Right.
And I actually think that, you know, there is a proportion of the conservative movement who they're having fun right now
Mhm.
attacking universities, but I genuinely think they'll miss them when they're gone.
Yeah.
Because much of, you know, if you think about like the numbers of the graduating class of schools like Harvard that are going
Yeah.
into consulting and going to work
Right.
on Wall Street,
Yeah, those are
no,
their
that,
proteges, right?
right, right,
Right.
Well, yeah, I think they kind of envision a beautiful future in which everything is even more privatized than it is now, right? Where we already have universities functioning largely like corporations, but hey, let's see how far we can take it. Where the only people who can even afford to participate at all are people who will come help them continue to extract and defile the planet.
right. I think you're right. I think the university and education as a democratizing mission is something that they are deeply opposed to, and
Mhm.
I do see them, you know, having sort of like an educated caste that
Yeah,
rules over the rest of us is you know, probably some of their explicit goal, right?
right.
Everybody's got a
Unfortunately.
little Play-Doh in them.
Right.
Oh, come on, Trent. Don't bring Plato into this. This was a nice, clean family podcast.
Everybody, yeah. I mean, the platonic urge to have guardians.
I
I
guess, yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know. If you can make it into a meme, I guess we can let it go. Yeah, okay. Oh man. Okay, let's go. The another kind of rhetorical through line that I have noticed is a focus on the idea of DEI as sort of an unaccountable, bloated administrative object. You see this in the executive orders. You also see this like did I listen to Steven Pinker talk to the Reason podcast? I sure did. Why do I do this to myself? We don't know. I'm a glutton for punishment. But, you know, he talks about this a lot where he's like, he calls them DEI bureaucrats. He says they're vested with all this power. He called out my school where I got my PhD from, UC Davis. Hooray. Apparently, we're some of the worst for this.
Mm.
I didn't notice, but, you know. While I was there. But this idea that like, oh, it falls into kind of the purview of Doge now because it's not efficient to have all of this, uh, all of this bureaucracy that's around making us do trainings and check our hiring practices against DEI policies.
So, I mean, I don't really know how to even think about this sometimes,
Yeah.
because it just to me it appears so detached from reality. Like,
I know.
Right.
what's the proportion of the university's funding that goes towards this bloated bureaucracy, right?
Right.
It's minuscule, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Also, you know, from folks who do work on sort of organizations and DEI since the 90s. There's been work showing that DEI offices are often sort of like cordoned off from the
Yeah.
actual main functions of the university. And so they hire, you know, a DEI representative. Often it is a person of color, and that person might have like a decent job in that particular niche, but there's no mobility strategy. It's
Yeah.
not like those folks move up the, as if you're a professor, right? Like you might be a professor and then a department chair and then a dean, right?
Yeah.
And the sort of the income and the status that goes with that is if you're a DEI officer, you might be an assistant DEI officer and then a DEI officer, and then that's it,
Then
right?
you're done. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's they've added these offices and they haven't sort of incorporated them into the full functions of the university.
Mhm.
And then, the stuff that people complain about sort of like writing a DEI statement for applications
Yeah.
for the workplace. So first of all, I feel like if you can't think about people's different learning styles or the different backgrounds that folks come from and how that might influence their
Right.
ability to navigate the classroom,
Right.
you're not doing a great job.
Yeah.
Secondly, if you look at a application, so I hope many of the listeners to this podcast haven't had to do an academic application.
They're
If
arduous.
if you have been on the academic job market, another one-page statement really isn't going to make or break the application. And then, as someone who has served on multiple hiring committees across multiple different places in academia, they were never the deciding factor.
Yeah.
Right? They are
Yeah.
rarely ever the deciding factor. There was this, so I'm not often recommending the Wall Street Journal, but there was this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal after affirmative action was overturned, and the guy was like, "Oh, now lots of mediocre white people are no longer going to have an excuse for their failures."
Right.
One of the things that he said in the piece that I thought was really interesting, because it's something that race scholars have said for decades, was that this the notion that a black man took your job
Yeah.
is very, very comforting.
Yep.
It's
Of course.
almost always evidence free and irrefutable, like you can't actually check.
Yeah.
But also what this guy said in the Wall Street Journal piece was that oftentimes, instead of telling potential employees that they were bad,
Yeah.
or that they what hiring folks would do was sometimes let them off easy by saying, well, we had to go with the diverse candidate, right?
Right.
I love the idea of a diverse candidate, like a person can be diverse. That always
Right.
drives me crazy.
Right.
But again, the intimation lies sort of unstated that, well, if a black man took my job, that intimates that I was always better at it than that
Right.
individual,
Yeah.
which
I
of
didn't
course
deserve
also
this.
has zero founding in any sort of evidence. We cannot necessarily understand this, but it's this subtle bias that sort of validates the preconception before it's said.
I remember being like a high schooler, and there was some white girl somewhere who tried to sue the university for doing affirmative action. Like, it's been going on since old ass me was a child, right? Like, this idea that like you could prove that some like lesser person of color has taken your spot in a way that's discriminatory and that you could sue over. I want to go back to the DEI statement thing, because a lot of times they will simply just pretend that it is a decision-making factor, right? And by they, I mean sort of the liberal anti-academia academics, such as Pinker. And one of the ones who's loudest about this is Jonathan Haidt, who is a psychologist, and he quit the Society for Personality and Social Psychology because they required a DEI statement. And he was like, that's coerced speech, that's forced speech, you can't make me do it, and you would discriminate against me for my viewpoint if I said something like I value colorblindness. And I looked at the actual document that says what you need to do, and it is so broad that like he could have absolutely said 100% things that he truly believes in his heart if he's not a monster, right? Things like
Right.
I care about like I don't know, like helping early career scholars get spots in conferences, things like that, where it's like, it doesn't have to do, you don't even have to say anything about race if you don't want to. If you truly deep inside don't believe that you should be doing things to help alleviate racial discrimination, fine, write your DEI statement about things like early career scholars or low income scholars or something that you do care about, and you will be totally fine. But he instead decided to do a public hissy fit about the Society for Personality and Social Psychology and how they've been taken over by, woke orthodoxy.
So a historical point here that I think is important for this discussion is that diversity as a strategy for universities came out of the University of California versus Bakke decision. I think it was like a 1976 or 78 decision, Supreme Court decision.
Okay.
And in that, Powell's
It's our best friend Powell
decision was like the key part of the decision that got taken up, right? And he has this line in there about trying to diversify and why diversity is important, right? And it became what folks call the diversity rationale. And he said something along the lines of like, a minority student and a farm boy from Iowa are both important, right? And both add something to the life of the university. And so, he takes a sort of like highly politicized, racialized identity, and then also, this sort of like
Superman, Clark Kent.
Right, Clark Kent. And this idea of, it's kind of like the fascist ideal of like the blood and soil,
a blue-eyed, muscular, hardworking young man.
But the point that I'm trying to get at here in terms of hate is like they don't even understand the genesis of the concept that they're critiquing, because what Powell was trying to do was make it broad enough that folks could advocate for the farm boy. And say this matters just as much as race or gender identity or, they weren't even thinking about LGBTQ identity in that decision. But, and that one of the things that diversity did that, critics on the left have said, and I think they're right, is that it watered down the reason that we had affirmative action or diversity policy in the first place. And that was not reparations, but a kind of reparations that said we have historically discriminated against certain groups of people based on these characteristics, and we need to ensure that we no longer do that, and we make up for that history a bit, right?
Yeah. Right. So it's again back to that sort of the privilege of ignorance, where he gets to just like pretend that this whole history of DEI wasn't already designed to allow him to do all of the stuff that he already wanted to do. And then he can tell it to us in that way so that we as the audience don't really have a good way to know what he's not telling us, right?
Right. It allows you to target the people who need those benefits while pretending that you have some sort of higher-minded principle in mind. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So yeah, where are we at?
Right. No one wants to just come out and say they're pro-segregation.
Right.
So they can say this is a free speech issue.
Yeah. Oh, good. We're in meta-discursive sidestepping.
But they've always done that, right? It's like we have to talk about lowering taxes, right? But Adwater said like that's really just to use Caitlin and Professor Bradford's term, right? That's like the meta discussion. That's the meta discourse,
right?
Yeah.
Because the actual thing is hurting people. But we can't say that we want to hurt Black families or Black children or poor people, so we have to do it in this goofy way where it's
and then if you pull us up on it, we can yell and make a lot of noise about how you're stopping us from free
states' rights. States' rights.
So I will say this: I think what is different about the current moment is that the quote unquote anti-DEI folks are pushing for a repeal of this kind of subterfuge. right? I think they are I mean, like Musk and Bannon were doing Nazi salutes, right? Like
Yeah.
Right.
they're saying actually not being able to be open about this and doing the Atwater strategy is a kind of oppression. It kind
Right.
of takes away. No, I'm being
No,
serious.
that's right. That
You're
is right.
right.
Yeah.
That this takes away my white prerogative to not
Yeah.
just feel this way, but to also openly denigrate folks who I believe are below me,
Right.
Yeah.
and that they're pushing for that to be part of the conversation in the public sphere. And
Yeah.
so I do think that that is very different than sort of the colorblind move that someone like Haidt still needs to make in order
Yes.
to, get invited to the right cocktail parties and keep
100%
being
right.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to go to the MAGA parties. He still wants
Right,
to go
right.
to the ones with the nice champagne flutes,
Right.
where they can all stand by the fireplace and listen to Mozart or whatever. I'm out of highfalutin things. Sorry. All I know is Bluey and Little Mermaid right now.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But yeah, so they want to go to the right parties, right? And then you got these guys on the Musk Doge Vance side that are like, no, let us hire the kid who said normalize Indian hate, right?
Exactly.
Let
Exactly.
us hire the guy who thinks that interracial marriage is wrong, and then let's see what Vance, who's in one, does about it, which is nothing.
Nothing.
Right.
Yeah, so it is about an emboldening. And since we're talking about emboldening, I think there's been a lot of conversation about like, where does MAGA want to take us back to, right? And so there's a way to argue that MAGA wants to take us back to the days of segregation, sort of like the 40s and 50s maybe, where we had like clear cut sort of segregation. But there's also an argument that they want to take us back to something like the 1890s, right? Where like it's sort of the backlash to Reconstruction, and it's also a total lack of protection from regulation that lets us have things like clean running water or food that isn't poisoned, or things like that. And I think that is extremely exemplified in this idea of freedom cities. I don't know if you've heard much about this, Victor.
Right. It's like the libertarian utopian company towns.
What?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
It's Gary, Indiana, except it has the tenement structure of New York City in 1900. That's what they want.
They want Pullman, Illinois, right? So they want kind of a planned community, and they'll draw the most beautiful diagrams in the world. There's so much greenery there. But like truly the one they want the most is in Presidio Park, which is in San Francisco. And it's like, are you going to pull up a bunch of our beautiful trees in Presidio Park and put your community there? Anyway, but what they want, right, is for that area to be essentially insulated from federal regulations. And to me, that sounds just like the sort of Virginia coal towns, the kind of place where they would put up these sort of shacks with no running water to put the workers in, and the workers had no ability to object to it, right? Because they depended on the company that had provided the housing to stay in the housing.
Right.
Company housing, company money.
Yeah, script,
company
using script
rules,
in the company stores. And,
yeah.
Those were all segregated racially. Of course they were. And so you had, that hill is where all of the black workers live. This hill is where all the Irish workers live. This hill is where all the white workers live. Going back to that sounds just awful, and being run by some of the most irredeemable dweebs this planet has ever produced. Like the fact is they built a place, they built a couple places like this, and nobody wants to live there. So I don't know what their plan is.
Right. So yeah, I'm not sure. Is there a question there, or?
No, there's no question there.
That was a rant,
being
Victor.
mad about freedom cities. So yeah, we were like 50 minutes into the podcast, and it's the part where Caitlin just goes off the rails.
Okay.
There's always one of those.
Well, no, it's okay. We hit the one where Trent asks a question that seems
makes
strange,
no sense.
right? And then we got to Caitlin ranting.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all good.
we've hit all of our bases. I should do an outline that's honest like that. That's just like, listen, we're gonna do a couple of topics, and then Trent's gonna ask a question that it takes you 10 minutes just to hear, and then we'll do another topic, and then Caitlin will just go wild on some topic that's tangentially related, right? Okay, so anyway, let's check our checklist, right? We talked about anti-racism is racist, actually. We talked about the idea of like merit and fairness and how those things get used in opposition to DEI. Last thing that I really wanted to touch on, because I've been hearing this for a long time, is the idea of, we want equality of opportunity. You want equality of outcome. And to get the equality of outcome, you're going to do a bunch of stuff that's discriminatory. Right. And so that has to do, I think, with sort of folk or like layperson's understanding of what equality versus equity is. And I wonder if you could speak on that a little bit.
Right. So I think two things here.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, when I see an unequal outcome, I assume that there's some mechanism there that's discriminatory that's causing that outcome, right? There aren't groups of people who want to make less money or not get hired or not have access to education or not be treated equally in the criminal justice system. The United States has done a whole host of things repeatedly and to the current day to ensure that those outcomes are unequal between races. It has done very few things to effectively ensure equality. So I think the question itself, although there are good faith people asking it, I think the question itself is often in bad faith, and it refuses to take into account both historical and contemporary structural racism that, like any honest scholar, even those on the right, will be like, yeah, actually, the criminal justice system is pretty.
It's like really borked.
Right? Like you can't. The data, it's like I often compare folks who ask this to like global warming skeptics, right? And it's like, okay, 99.9% of the scientists say this. You have RFK over here, RFK Jr. over here saying something different. I'm going to go with the scientists, right? And so when I see this, what causes sort of unequal outcomes, it's not, if it's culture, it's white culture. Discriminating, right? It's not something inherent in Black culture or Latino culture. The other thing is, where is this sort of quest for equality of opportunity at sort of earlier stages of the system, right? So you hear this, you hear about this in, access to college because white parents are mad that this imaginary friend they've invented in their head has deprived their kids of access. But you don't hear them say, I want equality of opportunity, so I'm going to make sure that like my elementary school is desegregated, that my neighborhood is desegregated, that every school in my state gets equal per pupil funding, right? And so if you ignore the sort of downstream inputs that produce inequality and then say you want equal opportunity, I just think you're a liar, right? I just think that like you're not actually focused on the kinds of things that would provide equal opportunity, and then you're looking at the outcome of a system and blaming the victims of that system for saying you've done wrong this long, and now here's a place where you can kind of make up for that a little bit.
So it relies again on that sort of shortened timeline, right? Of we want equality of opportunity, but we refuse to look back on the kinds of opportunities that have been denied to people and that we're still doing early on in their lifetime. That makes it so that when they get to the college application, they can't put together an application that's as attractive as their white counterpart, right? Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't ever see any of them talking about, hey, we have to make sure that, schools are nicely segregated or that schools are funded even. My county is going through school board elections right now. And we're just still having to fight off people who want to kind of keep people out, and who want to do school choice stuff and, like, give our public school money over to private schools that are going to be even more discriminatory in their practices,
Right.
as opposed to actually providing the equality of opportunity that we say that we're interested in, right?
Right.
Right.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's probably is that a good note to end on, or is that too depressing? I guess that's the whole thing.
Yeah, this is all terrible. All terrible, but we got to talk it out to know how we can
Yeah.
try to fight her off.
Is there anything else you think is relevant to this conversation that you would like for sort of good faith progressive and liberal listeners to think about when they're thinking about DEI?
I mean, I think really the most important thing about this current moment in terms of like DEI is how dishonest the public conversation is,
Mhm.
Right.
in that they are using DEI to attack civil rights.
Mhm.
And I think, the framing of people are retreating from DEI is just fundamentally dishonest.
Right. So when you hear the phrase DEI, just ask yourself sort of, okay, but what's the actual material policy proposal on the table? What are
Exactly.
the actual effects uh, of the thing that this person is advocating or arguing against, as opposed to just leaving it at DEI, because that as a label doesn't always mean what you think it means.
Right. So, for example, Trump had an EO overturning Johnson's desegregation of the federal workforce
Right.
or federal contractors.
Yeah.
And all of the headlines were like DEI.
Yeah.
Right.
And I was
Right.
like, no, this is like a key victory of the civil rights movement that they are trying to get rid of.
Yeah.
This has very little to do with like the admittedly irritating policies that,
Yeah.
you might have to watch a video at work.
Yeah, this isn't canceling the video training that you had to do on a
Ex-
Wednesday night when you wanted to have dinner instead, right?
Right, right.
This is literally resegregating the contract, federal contract
I
company.
don't even understand that. I've get paid to watch a movie, a 10,
Well, yeah,
5,
okay,
5,
so
10 minutes. Who in their right mind gets worked up about something like that?
well, let me tell you about my experience working as a teacher in a private school where we don't have to do that because our company is like really sort of libertarian and weird. And what happened was we didn't take any of those. We took the mandatory reporter training because everyone literally has to, but we didn't take any kind of like DEI or racial sensitivity training or anything like that. And what ended up happening is I became the person that all the high schoolers would come to when one of their teacher would say something casually racist to them. And it happened not infrequently.
Right.
Because we have a large Asian, like East Asian and Southeast Asian student body due to being a STEM school. And we would go, I would sit down with them and I'd be like, what did he say to you today? And then they would tell me the thing. They'd be like, he thanked me for the existence of kimchi. And then I would be like, okay, do you want me to like cause a stink about this, or do you just want to tell me so that somebody hears it and goes, well, that's messed up? And they're like, I just want to tell you. And then like that's my lunch hour. It's like, and maybe if that teacher had to take a couple of hours of annoying training, he would remember not to thank a random Asian student for the existence of like Korean food.
I think there's something in what you said that I think is interesting, and I haven't like really thought this through.
Yeah.
But it's like the burden of who has to understand other folks, right? And so, or who has to understand difference. And so then that example you used,
Yeah.
Teachers in that school felt no need to understand sort of the culture or background, or to not sort of like problematize or exoticize difference from their students.
Yeah.
But the students, in order to, navigate the system, actually have to understand white culture very well.
Yes.
Right.
And it is, and so one of the things that folks are irritated with when it comes to watching a video is being forced to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Because the privilege of power means you don't have to
Yeah.
learn about other people in the way that folks below you in the hierarchy have to learn about you in order to navigate the hierarchy. And so lots of what folks are irritated about, I think this comes up in conversations about microaggressions, or even in Me Too stuff, where men are like, I didn't understand why commenting on her appearance would be upsetting, is the fact that it takes away, or it makes apparent, power relations that folks just want to enjoy without questioning, right? They
Yeah,
just
I think
want the privileges
I
of.
think it feels like a completely undue burden when you're sort of in the default position of a culture, of a
Right.
society, right? To have a few things in your head that are sort of moderating and mediating the things that you feel comfortable saying.
Yeah.
But that is simply the condition of being a human being who has to interact with other people, right? That like, I'm not gonna say everything that I think of in the first moment, because I'm aware that not all of it is a good thing to say. Whereas that teacher, he was considered sort of like the fun, cool teacher, slightly because he was a bit of a loose cannon in that way, and that was all sort of it contributed to his persona as a teacher. Whereas these students are hearing what he's saying, and they're taking all of the fallout of that, and they're bringing it to somebody like me who has said, hey, I will listen to whatever problems you have and I'm not going to judge you. And then like, we have to just sit there and be like, why are we here expending all this energy thinking about the nonsense that he's doing, and he's just at lunch, right? he's enjoying his BLT, and we're sitting here being like, I'm really sorry that he said that thing to me. Because also what happens if we cause a stink is
then you become the problem.
Yeah, we get into the Sarah Ahmed like killjoy feminist situation where like by noting the problem, you become the problem, and all of the ire of the system comes down on you because it wouldn't have been a problem.
Well, I've heard it throughout my life. If folks just stop talking about racism, right, it wouldn't exist. Right, the only reason it exists is because folks keep bringing her up, and of course this logic seems absolutely outrageous, nonsensical, but as you noted earlier before, Victor, you're gonna come up with folks into contact with folks who are not really trying to hear what good sense you might have, what facts you might have, what ideas you might have. And so you just kind of got to bite down on that and say, wow, like this is legitimately like who I'm speaking with, folks who think that like, black people are causing the racism by like bringing up things that they perceive to be racist.
It's the motivated reasoning of wanting to keep things flowing, right? We don't want to stick anything in the path to cause things to change, because that will be disruptive.
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us, Victor. And we had a great time talking about, nonsense as usual. And Victor's book on critical race theory, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care, is available. Is there anything else that you want people to know about that you've put out?
No, I mean,
the recent article in The Emancipator is great. It's all about the rollback of DEI and what it really means. I recommend everybody read it. We'll put a link in the description.
Absolutely. Everything Victor does is fantastic, including our chat today. We really appreciate you finding some time to parse through all of this with us. And won't you come back and do it all over again sometime?
Sure.
It's a party. All right, we will see you later. Thank you so much, Victor. This has been Half the Answer, where understanding a question is half the answer.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, Understanding a question is half the answer.